Hi everybody, this is Mary and welcome to week 5 of constructions of masculinities and femininities. So I'm going to try to wade through some of the reading again for you. And let's start with studying men and masculinities because that's always our toughest one. So in chapter 5, Buckbinder wants to talk about pockets of resistance. So there are a couple of important points here. One important point is actually how we are defining masculinity, which is really complicated the way he's doing it, and I'm going to hopefully walk you through that. But the first point that he wants to make is that we don't want to think in terms of throwing over patriarchy. So we don't overthrow patriarchy or turn it over, because power doesn't work like that. If you think about overthrowing something, then there's something coming down on top of you and you throw it off. You're underneath, you're oppressed. But according to Foucault, Michel Foucault, the theorist who's behind a lot of what Buckbinder is doing, power doesn't operate that way. Power isn't a monolithic top-down thing, but power bubbles and seeps. It's like water that erodes and has pockets of resistance coming out. We all have power. Nobody has a sieve on us kind of pressing us down. So power is fluid, diffuse, and there are little pockets of resistance all over. So we don't want to think in terms of necessarily overthrowing patriarchy as if we could dismantle one big system, but instead we want to look at those pockets of resistance, right? And remember what we talked about patriarchy is last week. Patriarchy is a way of organizing our thinking, way of organizing our bodies and our relationships. I really like that one. If you can think in terms of patriarchy as a way of organizing our relationships, it's also a way of distributing power. So patriarchy isn't so much the rule of the father anymore, where men can only own property and men own women. It's not like that anymore, but we still have a system of power, of access to power, a way of organizing relationships, and a way of thinking. That's patriarchy. So these pockets of resistance come up and they change what patriarchy is. But one of the things that Buckbinder points out to us is how tricky a dominant narrative is. So we have a dominant narrative of, let's say, in our culture, that heterosexuality is normal. That's a dominant narrative. And this narrative is so powerful that any dominant narrative is so powerful, it can take little things of resistance and rework the truth so that it fits the dominant narrative. I'm going to tell you the passage I'm referring to here. It's on page 98. Given the capacity of dominant, powerful discourses to co-opt acts that question and contest their power, and to re-signify them to their own advantage, resistance in Foucauldian theory as a general strategy needs to be maintained. A single moment of resistance does not constitute a victory for the resistors. So the important point that I like there is that the capacity of the dominant, powerful discourse to co-opt acts that question and contest their power. You know what I thought when I read that? I thought of Barack Obama. So we have a dominant, powerful discourse of white privilege and power ruling American politics. That's a dominant, powerful discourse of whiteness. And Barack Obama challenged that, questioned it, changed it. But in so many ways, President Obama has acted so much in concert with the vested interests of power that the dominant narrative of whiteness as supreme in American politics and culture, that's still pretty solid. So we can have an African American president, we can have a Cuban American senator, potential presidential candidate. We can have those things. There's little pockets of resistance and change, but the dominant discourse of whiteness is so powerful that it can fold in even a Barack Obama and continue on. So that came to mind, I think, as a good example of how dominant discourses prevail, even when something happens to change the way they work. So, okay, now here is the tricky part about masculinity. This is what Buchbinder is saying. Oh, so the point about Obama and that whiteness is still prevailing is that Foucault would say, in order for real change to happen, we can't just have these Barack Obamas and I can't remember the name of the Indian Republican governor, the other politicians who aren't white. We can't just have these disparate things. We need sustained resistance, right, to make real change. So the next section is objection, misogyny, and homophobia. And here, what Buchbinder is trying to do, he's working with something in linguistics that Julia Kristeva, he talks about Julia Kristeva, and she talks about the abject. What is abject and about objection? And objection is purging ourselves of the things that we loathe the most. Like, that's abject. It's revulsive. It's awful. Like, we want to get rid of these things. And what Buchbinder is saying is that in some ways, masculinity is defined by what it rejects, by what it is not, by what is inappropriate for masculinity, which would be it is inappropriate to give masculinity to women, and it is inappropriately given to gay men. So masculinity as a performance and a practice must not include women and gay men. Now, of course it does, because women have masculine characteristics and gay men do too, etc. But at its core, as an ideology, masculinity defines itself by what it is not. And to be masculine, think about this, to be masculine in today's culture is not to be a woman and not to be a gay man. And if you can get women and gay men out of the picture, there you have masculinity, and this is how it's defining itself. And this is a linguistic kind of maneuver that we know we define things in part by what they're not. So in part we know that it is day because it is not night. We know that this is a book because it is not a table. So there's this thing in linguistics where we define things by comparing them to the things around us, so we know what they're not. So this is what Buchbinder is doing with masculinity. He's saying we can tell what masculinity is by looking at what it rejects as not women, not gay men. And part of the crisis in masculinity, the problem, is that how we see women and how we've been seeing and defining gay men has undergone massive transformation. So there's been so much change coming organically from gay men and from women. And masculinity hasn't been the driver of this change, but it's had to respond to how gay men and women are now being constructed and adapt itself so that it can still say, not me for women, not me for gay men. So that's what he's trying to say about masculinity as being defined by what it objects, by what it rejects, the thing that it likes the least, which would be women or gay men. Now, there's a scholar named Michael Kimmel who wrote a terrific piece called Masculinity as Homophobia. And I think, Abby, if you're watching this, and a couple other people, if you've taken intro with me, we read Masculinity as Homophobia. And in it, Kimmel really says that masculinity is a performance for other men, whereas they are proving to themselves all the time that they're not women and they're not gay. And at the heart of masculinity is a deep homophobia, a very deep desire to distance oneself from gayness. So I think that sums up, Buchbinder. So you want to think of masculinity as what it is not, gayness and women, and how it defines itself against those things. Okay, so I know this is getting a little long, but I'm going to talk a little bit about chapter 5 here. And this is, oh my goodness, this chapter was on how all of a sudden domesticity became a science. And I did want to say one thing about the previous chapter that I forgot to mention, and I can't remember how much the writers, Aaron Reich and English, go into this. But when they talk about women in the 19th century being hysteric and being confined to bed and, weak and kind of languishing away, remember, this was an ideal that belonged to the white upper class, the aristocracy. It was an ideal. But just because that ideal was played out among the privileged didn't mean that other women did not aspire to the ideal. So all women, poor women, working women, maids, women who weren't white, all women aspired to the ideals that were inherent in sickness. But of course, if you're a maid, a nanny, a cook, you do not have the luxury of lounging about in bed. So for a lot of poor women, they were doubly hurt by this because they were forever barred from meeting the goals of femininity because they couldn't be sick because they had to work. Okay, not too much to say about this chapter because I think it's pretty clear how Ellen Richards was at the heart, this woman who went to MIT and got her BA in chemistry, was at the heart of turning domesticity, cleaning, cooking, all these things into a science and into a full-time job to keep us very, very busy. Okay, so women were no longer making their own clothes, making their own soap, making their own candles, whatever, but instead women had to clean and scrub, and cooking eventually began to take on new nuance too, but there were germs in food, all kinds of things to be navigated at home. So the thing that I found kind of interesting about this is, again, Michel Foucault, that philosopher, he wrote a book called Discipline and Punish. And in this book, he talks about how, and I think I might have mentioned this, how we internalize kind of that I, that of what you should be doing, that I that regulates behavior. And so we all have that when we perform gender, even when no one is around. I might comb my hair a certain way and put on a skirt. I'm home all alone today, and I didn't do it for you guys. So I just perform gender on my own. And it's because we internalize, we take in these rules, and we police ourselves. So Foucault talks about in the prison how this initially prison systems were set up so that someone was watching you all the time, and you knew it in the prison. There was a panoptic kind of setup, so someone was always watching you. Eventually, that changed, but it didn't matter because the prisoner still believed somebody was watching him and would act accordingly, follow all the rules, be very demure, etc. And so for me, part of this domestic science moment in history seems very Foucauldian about the disciplined and punished body. So we get that female body in the house, cleaning and cooking and scrubbing and very much being productive, because the disciplined body is a productive body. So the male body is out being productive in the workplace, and the female body is very busy being productive at home. No one's making us do this, but yet at the turn of the century, this is what women did. And then another thing I thought of when I read this is that if Buckbinder is right, and of course he is, that what it means to be female, femininity, women, and gay men have changed a lot over time. Masculinity is changing in response. And this is really clear in the areas of parenthood, when we think about parenting duties with women, gay men, straight men, etc. But when I thought about those changes in what it means to be male and female in the home, I thought about capitalism and magazines like Real Simple or Martha Stewart or any number of things that can keep us all so busy organizing and cleaning and decorating and kind of the care of the home. And capitalism, the demands of capitalism, I would say, are so big that it's helped to shift a little bit of those gender roles so that masculinity has expanded a little bit, where it's okay to be a home decorator, a shopper, to be, into the house and care of the house. It's not exclusively a female realm anymore. And I think that evolution of kind of care of the home, not just the bricks and mortar, like traditional male care of the home, shoveling or painting the exterior, that care of the home and the hearth sensibility, cooking, decorating, cleaning, more of an intimate domesticity, has extended itself to great profit to men. So to me, this would be a good example of where capitalism and masculinity might come together. Capitalism shapes masculinity. So, okay, I hope that helps a little bit with Buckbinder, and I guess that's it. So thanks, guys, and have a good week in class.